Welcome to our podcast. My name is Ellis.
And my name's Leo.
And we're going to be talking about behavioral economics. So what behavioral economics is basically the study. It's a combination of psychology and economics to describe why people make irrational economic decisions. It kind of counteracts the traditional economic model and factors in emotion and, laziness and all of that. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is kind of the overarching theme of behavioral economics. It's called prospect theory. It was first developed by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. It basically explains how humans value gains and losses differently, leading to decisions that differ from standard economic predictions. In other words, prospect theory examines how humans react to losses and gains irrationally, which makes them choose economic decisions that don't make sense if you look at economics from an objective standpoint, like I said. The central component is called loss aversion. This concept explains how losses hurt more psychologically than equivalent gains.
And to expand on loss aversion, it's basically just that humans feel more pain from loss than they do joy from gain. An example again is like losing $20 feels a lot worse than finding $20. And it also helps explain why we hold on to things like old clothes or old habits, because it feels like when you give them up, it's losing something, even if it's not helping you anymore. And knowing this can allow you to take smarter risks, apply for a scholarship or try for a leadership position and just switch to doing new things, even if your brain is trying to say stick with what's safe.
The first component of loss aversion is called the endowment effect. People assign higher value to things solely because they already own them, like Leo said. Individuals often demand more money to sell an item than they own than they would be willing to pay to acquire it. For example, a person may decide not to sell an old gaming console that is now worth upwards of $1,000 because it is theirs, but would not be willing to pay that amount at the store to buy the same console that is not theirs. Why that's important to note is because you'll find that you often treat some dollars differently than you treat other dollars. And if you're trying to save money, you want to try and treat all dollars the same. You want to try and treat money as fungible. That's a topic that we'll be touching on again later. But that's a really important component of saving money.
This next behavioral economics segment is about mental accounting, and it kind of goes off of the endowment effect. It's that individuals treat money differently depending on where you're intending on using it, and this can lead to irrational financial behaviors. And for example, it could be someone getting a tax refund and then they start using that more freely just because they feel like it's found money, and they should really just be treating that as extra income that they made and saving that and using that smarter. Another example, if someone found $20 on the ground, they're more likely to spend it on something than the money they've worked hard for, because it feels less difficult to get to the money. And knowing this allows you to create much better saving habits and not spend your money irrationally, and set good saving goals and reach those goals.
All right, so the status quo bias is the next effect I want to talk about. Like we said with the endowment effect, individuals have a preference for their stuff, their typical routine, and the status quo bias explains how people are resistant to change. And this bias can result in bad decisions, such as sticking with an inefficient investment or insurance plan simply because it is familiar. This is also kind of tied into what I was talking about, laziness. Oftentimes, it's just a lot easier to stick with something that you're already doing, and that can unfortunately be very inefficient. Like we talked about, treating money the same way, the next effect that I want to touch on is present bias, and that's the tendency to favor immediate rewards over future ones, which leads to decisions that prioritize short-term gratification at the expense of long-term benefit. This ties into a very human desire to have instant dopamine. And kind of an example of this would be if you're hungry and you go to the gas station and buy snacks when you could just wait for dinner and save money and save up for the bigger expense that would, satisfy you more than those gas station snacks. So, yeah. Those are both important because it's good to be aware of how you're spending your money and to not get stuck in a routine that can lose you money. And it's good to develop good habits with spending. Make sure that you're making the smartest decision, the most grounded decision, and make sure that you're saving for the things that you want that will help you more than instant rewards.
All right, the next segment of our podcast here is some common misunderstandings about behavioral economics. Our first one is that it disproves the traditional economics view. It's more that behavioral economics is a supplement to it and adds on to the more fundamental traditional approach to economics.
The next common misunderstanding that we'll talk about is that people are irrational all the time. Behavioral economics suggests that in certain contexts, people act differently than would have been expected or what's rational, but it's not all the time that people make irrational decisions. A lot of the times people, feel emotionally connected to the rational decision. So it doesn't mean that you always have to be thinking about what people are going to do if they're being irrational. Sometimes people naturally make the rational decision. And then to touch on some surprising or unexpected details about behavioral econ, number one would be that people often feel more regret from inaction than action, even when the outcome is the same. This kind of flips the usual assumption that acting and failing is worse. People are often, afraid to act on or take a risk financially, but it ends up that, a lot of people feel a lot of regret from not doing anything. So that kind of counteracts what you may think, but that's what the truth is.
An example of that is like investing. Someone not investing their money when they were younger, and then when they hit that retirement age, they see that if they had just been more proactive about their spending and saving and investing, they would have been able to multiply their money without even having to do anything and just have that passive income that would have been generated just in the years of them living and investing their money.
And then the last couple of surprising details is that money isn't always a motivator. You may think that everybody's motivated by money. They make, decisions because they want money. That's what a lot of people are looking for, but sometimes symbolic rewards like a thank you or a piece of candy are more motivating than cash, which is especially true in social contexts. So for example, you may be motivated to work longer hours at your job, even if you're not getting paid overtime, because you can be a part of an exclusive party at your workplace. But that's not always what's best for you, but that's just how people's minds work oftentimes. And then the last surprising detail is that behavioral economics can persist even when we're aware of them. So even though we know all this stuff, the endowment effect, the status quo bias, we may not be able to make the right decisions even with that knowledge. When we're looking at this, when we're listening to this podcast, I hope you guys have some takeaways about, what decisions to make, what to look at, what to think about. But remember that you're not going to be perfect, and that oftentimes you will fall into these same traps, and that it's just better to be aware of them, but you're not always going to be able to avoid them. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.